Kitwa Memiskak Kipigiskwewin no Pasquak. Language Reclamation of the Plains by Darian Achikate. Before contact from coast to coast, indigenous languages flourished, but the effects of colonialism has dwindled the number of speakers in all languages to dangerously low levels. Presently, on the plains you have languages such as Cree, Soto, Blackfoot, and the Siouan languages, among others. On the east coast, much of the language has been lost, but you can find languages such as Mi'kmaq and Maliseet still spoken today. On the west coast, the most diverse in Canada, you have languages such as Tlingit, Haida, Tsimshian, and the Salish languages. And in the most northern reaches of Canada, you have Dene and Inuktitut as the main languages. The settler society first used Indigenous languages as a tool for trade, friendship, and survival. But as Canada was formed, the attitude towards Indigenous languages began to turn sour. This video will demonstrate the different tactics and policies the government used to try rid of Indigenous languages in Canada, such as Cree here in Saskatchewan, but also how the government is making attempts today to revitalize Indigenous languages and the dangers of the situation. Canada is based on Indigenous languages. The name Canada derives from the Iroquois language, more specifically the Tuscarora peoples. Its meaning translates to my village. The name Saskatchewan comes from the Cree word Kisaskatchewan, meaning it flows fast, swift, referring to the Saskatchewan River. The name Manitoba comes from the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe word Manitoba, meaning the Strait of the Spirit, referring to Lake Manitoba. Even Ontario has its name origins in an Indigenous language, as it comes from the Iroquois word Ontario, meaning beautiful lake. Even with all the Indigenous language use in place names such as these, Canada still aimed to get rid of Indigenous languages altogether and replace them with English. Before we start to discuss policies that aim to revitalize Indigenous languages in Canada, we must first look at tools used by the government that attempted to rid of Indigenous languages, namely residential schools. Residential schools were a systematic government-sponsored attempt to destroy Aboriginal cultures and languages and to assimilate Aboriginal peoples so that they no longer existed as distinct peoples. English, and to a far lesser degree French, were the only languages permitted to be used in most schools. Students were punished, often severely, for speaking their own languages. Many of the almost 90 surviving Aboriginal languages in Canada are under serious threat of extinction. In the 2011 census, 14.5% of the Aboriginal population reported that their first language learned was the Aboriginal language. In the previous 2006 census, 18% of those who identified as Aboriginal had reported an Aboriginal language as their first language learned, and a decade earlier, in the 1996 census, the figure was 26%. This indicates nearly a 50% drop in the 15 years since the last residential schools closed. The lack of Indigenous language use was used as an argument by Pierre Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, as to why Aboriginal peoples should not receive specific rights in the Canadian Constitution. In addressing Native leaders in 1983 at the First Ministers' Conference that eventually led to enshrining Aboriginal rights within the Canadian Constitution, Pierre Elliott Trudeau and René Lévesque remarked, "If you no longer speak your language and no longer practice your culture, then you have no right to demand Aboriginal rights from us because you are assimilated with the ruling power." Around this time, many Indigenous communities took this comment to heart and began to work amongst themselves to find a solution. And surprisingly, a little later in time, the federal government did a 180 and began to see the importance of Indigenous languages. At the turn of the century, the federal government began taking steps towards a plan for Indigenous language revitalization. A 2003 Heritage report called Language Revitalization an extremely high priority. Recommendations by a special task force in 2005 prompted the Liberal government of the day to commit $160 million to a proposed Aboriginal Languages Institute. But the Conservatives took power the following year and shelved the idea, which the Liberals had failed to enact. Then in 2008, the Inuit Language Protection Act was passed, which aimed to increase the number of speakers and revitalize and protect the Inuit language. Under the Act, Inuit have the right to work for the government of Nunavut in their own language. Municipalities must offer services in the Inuit language, and private businesses are required to display Inuit text as prominently as English and French. Fast forward to present day, and we are able to witness the fruits of our labor, as Nunavut, which has 3 official languages, the Inuit language, Inuktitut and Inuinnaqtun, English and French. is the only territory with a Language Protection Act. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its 6-volume report on the residential schools and what Canada and Canadians needed to do for reconciliation. The calls to action included number 14 for an Aboriginal Languages Act, and number 15 is for an Aboriginal Languages Commissioner. In December 2016, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that the federal government would develop an Indigenous Languages Act to support the revitalization of Indigenous languages. Trudeau said the act would be developed with Indigenous peoples in Canada, and the process of writing this legislation has begun. The Indigenous Languages Act, which is intended to support the reclamation, revitalization, maintaining, and strengthening of Indigenous languages in Canada, received royal assent on June 21, 2019. But many groups are hesitant to celebrate this Language Act for a variety of reasons. Language activists and teachers say it will take more than legislation to fix everything that's wrong with the government's current efforts at language preservation. They say the system is an administrative nightmare, poorly funded, and haphazardly run by the Department of Canadian Heritage and Indigenous Services Canada, rather than the people. Heritage's Aboriginal Languages Initiative, the only program at any level of government aimed solely at language revitalization, is so strangled in red tape that it routinely runs out of time to disperse more than $4 of every 5 from a yearly allocation of only $5 million. The Prime Minister said in speeches that revival of Indigenous languages was essential to help solve social problems on reserves, including youth suicide. The hodgepodge of existing programs, however, treat the languages either as a secondary concern or as a short-term endeavor. We've been talking about the importance of Indigenous languages for 50 years, said Stephanie Roy, director of Kanegewinteg Educational Institute, an Indigenous college on Manitoulin Island, Ontario. Every study, the UNDRIPT, and the TRC report support our children's right to learn in their language. We have to stop the rhetoric and just do it. More praise will be due if Bill C-91, the proposed new Indigenous Languages Act, actually helps Indigenous people to reverse the language erosion caused by residential schools by funding modern schools offering immersion in their ancestral languages. But that will be surprising, because Bill C-91 is not really a language rights law at all. Its preamble may be full of fine words, but its operative provisions carefully avoid implementing the kind of language rights, obligations, and enforcement mechanisms found in the Official Languages Act or the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The government may now accept that Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, includes rights related to Indigenous languages. But what rights? Any law that is serious about revitalizing Canada's Indigenous languages must enact the right of Indigenous parents to educate their children in their ancestral languages in publicly funded immersion schools. Bill C-91's failure to enact this right flies in the face of the government's stated commitment to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 1996, the court defined Aboriginal rights as the practices, traditions, and customs central to the Aboriginal societies that existed in North America prior to contact with the Europeans. This definition clearly includes the languages spoken by those societies. In 1999, the court held that language rights are meaningless in the absence of a duty of the state to take positive steps to implement language guarantees. In 2003, the court held that the purpose and promise of Section 35 is to protect practices that were historically important features of these distinctive communities. There can be no more important and distinctive feature of any community than its language. Section 35 thus recognizes and affirms the right of Canada's Indigenous peoples to perpetuate their language in the only way they can be and were perpetuated prior to contact with the Europeans, by teaching them to children. This language right then creates and imposes on Canada the obligation to fund schools offering immersion in those ancestral languages. Only immersion schools are capable of producing fluent speakers, and only fluent speakers are capable of passing the languages on to future generations. Bill C-91 should have simply enacted Article 14 of the Declaration, thereby recognizing both the right of Indigenous children to be educated in their own languages and the state's obligation to implement that right. But Bill C-91 also ignores our own Supreme Court's pronouncements on the scope and purpose of Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982, and on the obligations that language rights impose on the state. Apart from the legislation proposed that is aimed to revitalize Indigenous languages, many speakers and teachers have differing opinions on the possibility of Indigenous languages becoming official languages in Canada. This seems beneficial for language revitalization and reclamation, which it is, but the underlying danger of proposing that Indigenous languages become official languages of Canada is that it will integrate our people linguistically into the Canadian state, rather than being a separate entity of its own, further pushing the notion of us assimilating into the Canadian power. But rather than Indigenous peoples losing culture and teachings through forced assimilation, the culture, and in this case, the language, will integrate and slowly become a faction of the Canadian identity, all at the approval of Indigenous peoples because of the necessity and need for language survival for future generations. And this is troublesome while we are still trying to fight for our inherent rights. Furthermore, the way in which the government will structure language curriculums and teachings, which consists of written publications and classroom teachings, is not compatible with the way language is taught from an Indigenous perspective. In fact, it goes against some of the most intricate Indigenous values where we teach others by example, not strictly through words. Some Indigenous communities have taken the initiative using their own resources in order to preserve and revitalize the language. For example, in 1981, the Onion Lake Cree Nation took over education control for their children. The Keheo-Wachuston Cree Immersion School is one of the Onion Lake Cree Nation schools. This school has over 200 students and provides education for nursery to grade 4 students. The school uses the Gift of Language Immersion Program, which is a framework created to support First Nation language teachers. The framework was developed for the Cree language, but is designed so that any teacher can adapt the material for their own language. Also, the use of elders as resources is becoming more and more prevalent, as, especially in Onion Lake, most are fluent in the language and or speak it as a first language. Since 1981, the Keheo-Wachuston School, or Eagle's Nest, has produced many young Cree speakers and is a perfect example of how an Indigenous community can effectively take control of their own language education. Apart from Indigenous communities taking control of their own language initiatives, we see more and more young people dedicating their post-secondary careers and lives to reclaiming their Indigenous languages, such as Sandra Warriors, a Salish woman from BC, who is learning a Salish language from the last living fluent speaker in British Columbia, or Serena Graves, an Ojibwe woman from Minnesota, who after attending a family member's funeral was disheartened that she could not understand the traditional Ojibwe ceremony and took it upon herself to learn her language, and Leslie Skinner, a Métis man from Edmonton, who took it upon himself to learn his Indigenous language, Cree, and who is now fluent and can read, write, and also teaches the language in and around Edmonton. These success stories motivate others to reclaim their language without the inclination of government funding. This relates to myself personally, as I grew up on my reserve hearing minimal language, but when I came to university in 2016, something guided me towards the language. After taking my first Cree class with Nisisa Pandera no Kamesum Kagiitit, I knew that it was something that would change my life. In my second year, I switched my degree to Cree language literacy and am now currently in my 4th year of my degree. Coming to university, I did not speak any Cree, but now it has become a part of my everyday life. Also, I have had the opportunity to teach the language at a community, high school, and university level. I still have a long way to go before I am fluent, but with great mentors like Solomon Rat, I feel humbled just by knowing the amount of language I know now. In conclusion, the insistence of government inclusion in Indigenous language reclamation is meant to do well, but the underlying danger is that it will not fully implement or be equal with that of English or French. This is due to their lack of recognizing Indigenous rights, and more specifically, Indigenous language rights. Reclaiming our languages would further us from the Canadian state so we are distinct peoples and create a platform for Indigenous leaders to push for recognition of our inherent Indigenous rights. This is what we aim for as Indigenous peoples, but is not something the government will support and fund. Therefore, they will carefully construct legislations that disallow us from fighting for our inherent rights, such as the Indigenous Language Act, which gives all control of funding for Indigenous language revitalization to the government and not the people. Furthermore, the fight for official recognition of Indigenous language is a topic of debate, as this, as discussed earlier, will integrate us linguistically into Canadian state, thus distancing ourselves from being recognized as distinct peoples. But first and foremost, we must start relearning and reclaiming our Indigenous languages, as language is the foundation of a culture. For Indigenous oral societies, words hold knowledge amassed for millennia. A language also holds the stories, song, dances, protocols, family histories, and connections. Languages also often hold the community's customary laws that were eroded by the policies of the Indian Act. As many communities move towards a return to self-government, this loss of laws and systems of governance means some communities don't have that knowledge to draw upon. When a language dies, so does the link to the cultural and historical past. Without that crucial connection to their linguistic and cultural history, people lose their sense of identity and belonging. And this is the argument that has been posed again and again by the government, that most Indigenous people have integrated into the Canadian state and thus become assimilated. Reclaiming language allows us to disprove the Canadian state by holding teachings and knowledge that are older than Canada itself. By reclaiming our languages, it also gives us hope for the future, so that one day we are able to be self-governing, independent Indigenous nations who are able to converse and do business in our traditional languages. Isko pisum kachagasagit, isko maskosiaka opigege, ego sipi pemichuage. Maga ke pigisko eweno ma pigo tapimatan, ki spintaka gwe nisitotamik, ego mina takagwe mitone wichisoyek anma. O ma ke pigisko ewen ki spin kenote kiski itanawal. Kinanasko mitanawa o ma enitotamik. Until the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow. But our language will only survive if you find value in trying to understand, and also trying to study in earnest if you want to learn it. I thank you all for listening.